Bougainville Island, November 1943. The jungle here did not smell like a battlefield. It smelled of rotting vegetation and wet earth, and the sickly sweet scent of orchids decomposing in the suffocating heat. It was only 0900 hours, but the triple canopy rainforest blocked out the sun, effectively turning the morning into a perpetual green twilight that confused the senses. The temperature was already pushing 100 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity so thick it felt like breathing through a wet wool blanket that had been soaked in hot water. 2nd Platoon of the 3rd Marine Division was moving in a staggered column formation, patrolling a narrow game trail near the Empress Augusta Bay perimeter. They moved with the exaggerated, agonizing slowness of men who knew they were being hunted. There was no talking. No clanking of canteen cups against belts. The only sounds were the wet sucking noise of boots pulling out of black volcanic mud, and the deafening wall of insect noise, a constant high-pitched screech of cicadas that sounded like a million's tiny saw blades cutting through bone. Private First Class Miller walked fourth in line, his eyes scanning the impenetrable green wall of vines and ferns that pressed in on them from all sides. He was 22 years old from a coal mining town in Pennsylvania, and he gripped his M1903 Springfield rifle with hands that were bleached white from sweat and fear. The man directly in front of him was Corporal Higgins, the platoon's radio man carrying the heavy SCR 300 backpack radio. The radio's whip antenna swayed back and forth, catching on low-hanging branches, a metallic metronome marking their slow progress toward the unknown. Higgins stopped to adjust the heavy handset, which was slipping from his sweat-slicked grip. He opened his mouth to whisper a frequency check to the lieutenant. But he never spoke. There was no gunshot. The jungle was too dense and the insects were too loud to hear the muzzle blast. There was just a wet, meaty impact, like a heavy cleaver hitting a side of beef. Higgins's head snapped back violently, spraying a mist of red blood across the broad green leaves of a fern. He crumpled to the mud without a sound, the heavy radio dragging him down like an anchor into the deep ocean. "Sniper!" someone screamed, but the word was instantly swallowed by the jungle canopy. The platoon dove into the vegetation, scrambling for the cover of banyan roots and rotting logs, their gear rattling against the wood. Miller pressed his face into the mud, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape a cage. He waited for the crack of the second shot. He waited for the echo that would reveal the shooter's position. But there was nothing. No muzzle flash. No movement in the trees. No puff of smoke. Just the relentless screaming of the cicadas and the wet gurgle of Higgins dying 5 feet away, his hands clawing at the black earth. This was not a firefight. This was an execution. Somewhere up there in the canopy, hidden among the moss and the epiphytes, was a ghost, a Japanese sniper. He was likely tied to the trunk of a tree, 80 feet off the ground, wrapped in netting and palm fronds, waiting with the patience of a stone. He had ignored the point man. He had ignored the rifleman. He had waited specifically for the radio. He was surgically removing the platoon's ability to talk to the world, isolating them in the green hell. Miller peered over the root of a mahogany tree, his eyes straining to find a break in the pattern of the leaves. He saw nothing but endless green. The enemy wasn't just camouflaged. He was part of the forest, and he was waiting for someone to move to check on Higgins. The silence stretched out for 10 minutes, then 20. The heat grew heavier, pressing down on their helmets. A single drop of sweat rolled down Miller's nose and hung there, stinging his eyes, but he dared not wipe it away. He realized then that they weren't hunting the sniper. The sniper was hunting them, and the hunt had only just begun. Private First Class Miller did not move a single muscle for 20 minutes. He lay pressed into the rotting humus of the jungle floor, letting the biting ants crawl over his knuckles, because he knew that even the slightest movement was a death sentence. His mind, however, was racing, dismantling the geometry of the kill he had just witnessed with the cold logic of a survivor. He replayed the moment of impact in his head, like a film reel running in slow motion, frame by frame. The bullet had struck Higgins in the throat. The angle of entry suggested a high trajectory downward from the canopy, but that wasn't the detail that mattered. The detail that mattered was the timing. Higgins had turned his head to the left just before he died. The sun was rising in the east behind the platoon. For a split second, the glass face of the radio handset had caught the morning light. A flash, a glint, and then the bullet. The sniper wasn't just watching for movement, he was watching for the unnatural reflection of light that did not belong in the jungle. In this green hell of matte organic textures, anything that shined was a target. Miller looked at his own rifle, the M1903 Springfield. The bolt handle was polished steel. The scope, if he had one, would be a beacon calling for death. But he didn't have a scope. He was a rifleman, not a sniper. Yet he realized with a cold clarity that he couldn't fight what he couldn't see. He needed to make the ghost reveal itself. He needed to make the enemy fire again, but not at a man. Slowly, with agonizing caution, Miller moved his hand to his haversack. He didn't reach for a grenade. He reached for his trash. His fingers closed around the cold cylindrical shape of an empty C ration can. It was a B-unit can that had held beans and pork eaten cold 2 days ago. He dragged it out of the canvas sack inch by inch. It was garbage. Rusted along the rim, the label peeling off in the humidity, the lid jagged and sharp, where a P-38 can opener had chewed through the tin. To the uneducated eye, it was refuse. To Miller, it was raw material. He pulled his K-bar fighting knife from its leather sheath, the steel making a faint hiss that sounded like a scream in the silence. He didn't raise his head. Working entirely by feel in the mud beneath him, he began to modify the can. He scraped the remaining label off with his thumbnail, feeling the wet paper disintegrate. He dug a handful of black volcanic mud from the ground and smeared it over the sides of the tin, masking the metal obliterating the shine. He left only the bottom of the can, clean a 3-inch circle of tin plate that was still relatively bright. It wasn't a mirror, but it didn't have to be. It just had to be brighter than a leaf. Next, he took the tip of his knife and twisted it against the jagged rim, boring a small hole through the soft metal. The sound of steel on tin was a tiny metallic screech that made the man next to him flinch. Miller ignored him. He unlaced his left boot, slipping the long rawhide lace out of the eyelets. He tied one end of the lace through the hole in the can. He tested the knot, pulling it tight. It held. What he held in his mud-slicked hands was crude, ugly, and pathetic. It looked nothing like a weapon. It looked like a child's toy made of garbage. But as Miller looked at the shiny bottom of the can, he calculated the angles. If he could position this 20 yards to his flank, if he could angle it to catch the sun filtering through the canopy, and if he could pull the string to make it tremble just slightly, just enough to mimic the micro movements of a nervous soldier adjusting a rifle scope, then maybe he could trick a master hunter into taking a shot at a ghost. It was a gamble, a stupid, desperate gamble. But Higgins was dead, and the radio was dead, and unless Miller did something, the rest of them would be dead too. He took a breath of the heavy, wet air and began to crawl. The crawl to the flanking position took 45 minutes to cover a mere 20 yards of ground. Miller moved like a reptile, his belly sliding over the wet humus, pushing the modified C-ration can ahead of him with the tip of his rifle barrel. Every inch was a negotiation with terror. He knew that if he raised his head more than 6 inches off the ground, the ghost in the trees would put a 6.5-millimeter bullet through his skull, just like he had done to Higgins. The mud soaked through his uniform, chilling his skin, despite the heat. Thorns tore at his sleeves, but he did not stop. When he finally reached a small depression behind a rotting mahogany log, he carefully planted the can in the soft mud. He angled the shiny bottom face toward the east, tilting it precisely 20 degrees upward to catch the first rays of the sun that were just beginning to pierce the thick canopy. He checked the angle twice, ensuring it would reflect back toward the high tree line where the killer waited. He ran the rawhide lace back along the ground, burying it under wet leaves, so it wouldn't be seen as he retreated backward to his original foxhole. By the time he slid back into the safety of the earth, the sun was breaking through the mist. The jungle steamed. The heat rose in shimmering waves, distorting the air, making the trees look like they were breathing. Miller wrapped the end of the rawhide lace around his index finger, the leather digging into his skin. He watched the can. It was just a piece of garbage sitting in the mud, a brown lump of clay with a shiny eye. Then the light hit it. A single shaft of sunlight cut through the leaves and struck the exposed tin plate. It didn't glow, it flared. A sharp, piercing needle of white light shot across the clearing, aiming directly at the high canopy where the enemy was waiting. To a sniper, looking through a telescopic sight at 400 yards, that glint would look exactly like the reflection of a careless Marine adjusting his own optic. It was the signal every counter-sniper waited for. The mistake. Miller held his breath, his heart hammering against the mud wall of his foxhole. He waited for the shot. 1 minute passed, then 2. The jungle remained silent. The cicadas screamed, but the rifle did not speak. The sniper was smart. He wasn't a rookie who fired at every flash of light. He was waiting to see if the target moved. He was waiting for the biological rhythm of a living man. Miller closed his eyes and focused on his finger. He didn't pull the string. He twitched it. A microscopic movement. 20 yards away, the can shuddered. The reflection danced for a fraction of a second, shifting its angle just like a rifle scope settling on a target. It was a performance. Miller was acting the part of a nervous soldier through a piece of string. He waited again. Sweat rolled down his forehead and stung his eyes, but he didn't blink. He knew that up in the trees, the Japanese hunter was tightening his grip on the stock of his Arisaka. The bait was taken. The question now was whether the fish would bite or if he would realize the hook was made of tin. The jungle held its breath. For 3 agonizing minutes, the only movement in the entire sector was the microscopic vibration of a rusted tin can tethered to a Marine's finger by a bootlace. Private Miller lay in his foxhole, his body pressed so hard into the mud that he could feel the pulse of the earth. Or maybe it was just the blood thundering in his own ears. He twitched the string one last time. The can shifted. The glint of sunlight danced across the leaves. And then the ghost made his move. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a flash. High up in the canopy, about 80 yards away and 40 feet up a mahogany tree, a tiny blossom of yellow fire erupted from the darkness. It was the muzzle flash of a Type 99 Arisaka rifle. A split second later, the crack of the gunshot tore through the silence, whipping past Miller's flank and slamming into the mud near the decoy with a violent thwack. The Japanese sniper hadn't missed. He had simply shot the wrong target. He had fired at a reflection. Miller didn't think. He didn't hesitate. His body took over a biological machine built of training and adrenaline. He shifted his aim smoothly to the left, tracing the invisible line back to that fleeting blossom of fire. He didn't see the man. He saw the shadow where the muzzle flash had been, a darker patch of green against the light. He exhaled, emptying his lungs, to steady his hands, forcing his heart rate down. The front sight of his Springfield rifle settled on a dark patch of moss between 2 heavy branches. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against his shoulder, the heavy .3006 caliber round exiting the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. The sound was deafening, a thunderclap that shattered the jungle's quiet and sent birds screaming from the trees. Miller worked the bolt instantly, the mechanical clack-clack sounding loud in his ears, ejecting the spent brass casing and chambering a fresh round his eyes, never leaving the iron sights. He waited for the return fire. He waited for the sting of a bullet that would end his life. But the trees did not fire back. Instead, there was a different sound, a thrashing noise, like a heavy sack of wet grain falling through foliage. Branches snapped, leaves tore, and then, with a heavy final thud, something hit the jungle floor. The silence that followed was heavier than before. It was the silence of a verdict rendered. "Cease fire," the lieutenant whispered, though no one else was shooting. The platoon moved up slowly, rifles raised, converging on the base of the mahogany tree. Miller stood up, his legs trembling violently as the adrenaline dump hit his system, leaving him feeling weak and hollow. He walked toward the flanking position first. He needed to see it. The C-ration can was lying in the mud. It was no longer a can. The sniper's bullet had punched clean through the center of the tin, tearing the metal apart. The shot had been perfect. If that can had been Miller's head, he would be dead. The Japanese sniper hadn't missed. He had simply shot the wrong target. Miller swallowed hard bile rising in his throat and walked over to where the platoon had gathered around the fallen enemy. The body lay twisted in the roots. The sniper was small, wiry, dressed in a ghillie suit made of netted palm fibers that rendered him invisible even from 5 feet away. He was tied into the tree with a rope harness, which was why he hadn't fallen immediately. His rifle, a Type 99 with a long telescopic sight, lay beside him. Miller looked at the scope. The glass was wrapped in cloth to prevent reflection. This man was a professional, a master of his craft. He had done everything right, except for 1 second of curiosity. The lieutenant looked at Miller, then at the shredded tin can in his hand. He didn't say good job, he didn't offer a medal. He just nodded a grim acknowledgement of the geometry of survival. "Move out," he ordered. "We have a patrol to finish." Miller dropped the can. It landed in the mud beside the dead man's boot. A piece of rusted garbage and a master sniper both left to rot in the Bougainville heat. The platoon formed up and marched on, swallowing the fear, pushing deeper into the green hell. Miller checked his safety and wiped the sweat from his eyes. He was still alive. Not because he was a better shot, not because he was a hero, but because in the brutal calculus of war, sometimes a piece of trash is worth more than a rifle. The jungle closed in behind them, and the insects began to scream again, erasing all evidence that the duel had ever happened.